Welcome to the Curmudgeon Cafe podcast. My name is Benjamin Lewis. This week I interviewed Brad Fortier, a man with probably the most unique master's degree I've ever heard of, the interdisciplinary study of the Anthropology of improvised theater. Brad is also the co-founder of Happy Improv Fun Time, School of Improvisational Theater. I hope you enjoy this interview with Brad Fortier. Thank you for joining me here, Brad. Let's start at the beginning. Could you tell me about your early life and childhood?
I feel like it's like the psychoanalyst podcast. So first off, my name is Brad Fortier, and I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1970. To a police officer and a secretary. I have two siblings. I have a younger brother, and I have an older sister. I'm the middle of three. And growing up in Milwaukee, boy, how to talk about that. I think one of the fun things is I've now lived in two different cities my whole life that both had or have television shows about them. For those of you who are maybe a little bit younger, there was a television show called Happy Days. And Happy Days, back in the 70s and 80s when it was running, was a show about Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Richie Cunningham and all that kind of stuff. And now I live in Portland, Oregon, so Portlandia and all that. But let's go back to growing up. I don't know, I was a suburban white kid growing up on the fringes of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We had to live in the city. Because as a police officer, one of the regulations was you had to live within the city limits. So we lived basically barely inside those city limits. We were in a small house. Used to be the only house on the block. It was a farmhouse, kind of modernized. A little bit small for a family of five, but it grew as we grew. We did some modifications on it. One of the interesting things is that my father is one of 11 kids on his side, so I kind of grew up in a gang of cousins in my younger life. So his 8 sisters all lived in Milwaukee, and of course everybody started getting married and having kids. So I had, I think, within 2 miles of my home, about 10 cousins, and easily 7 of the 10 were around my age within 5 years either way. So a lot of my childhood was kind of spent hanging out with my cousins, and then slowly we got to know our neighbors in the neighborhood. And in terms, of other flavor from my childhood background, I was raised Catholic, but kind of Catholic light. It was really interesting. My parents had this approach. We used to go to church every Sunday for a long time. I think up until I was about 6. And then one morning, I think they were just dissatisfied with the attitudes that they were encountering. So they actually asked us kids, like, what exactly are you kids getting out of church? And do you want to go? Do you like it? And it was the first time, like, we had been asked to vote on anything. So we were like, well, we kind of hate getting up early. And we're not exactly sure, we do like it. So they're like, all right, well, we're going to do other things in terms of, dealing with spiritual life and all that. So that was an interesting defining moment. There was no downing, religion or church. It was just, they wanted to participate on a different level. But still went to Catholic schools and did all that. High school was great. Middle school, I guess some of the other interesting stuff is I became a Boy Scout when I was like, I think 11, 12, somewhere in there. And that was actually a really cool experience. I got to, connect with people have similar interests. We actually got to go camping a lot. Learned a lot of outdoor skills, which to this day I still use. And also just forged some really cool relationships. Like one of my close friends, his father went to high school with my father, and actually we are still close friends. 38 years later. I'm 44 now, if you couldn't do the math from 1970. No, I'm 45. Either way, fun stuff. Boy Scouts was pretty cool. And for a while, our scout leader was a friend of my father's, and he was an inspector for the police. One of the interesting things about being the son of a cop is you get exposed to cop culture. And also, which is really unique. It's packed with a lot of, at least in my experience, it was packed with a lot of divorcees and people who like to drink a lot and do other things a lot. And my father usually he wouldn't take us to a lot of non-family police functions because he was even questioning cop culture, especially since my father actually really believed in the motto to protect and serve. And he really disliked working with people who would discard that notion in favor of a power trip. I remember at one point when I was 17, I think, I had worked at a beer distributing place, beer capital. And, we would work till midnight about to get all the work done. We would basically work until the work is done. Well, I worked in breakage, which means if a case falls and a few bottles break, I basically repack it all and put it into a new case, and then it gets resold. Well, as a result of doing that, you kind of smell like beer at the end of the night. And so one night I was driving to a friend's house because at that time I would stay out till 3 and 4 in the morning. And I reached, the car was kind of fogged up. And as I was driving down the street, I kind of reached down to turn on the radio. And the car deviated enough where it kind of skimmed against another car and took their mirror off and scraped up against their body. So I pulled over, and a cop had seen it, and he pulled over as well. And the situation is that my father was leasing a car, so for some reason the car was not under my father's name. And so the police officer started haranguing me, suggesting I had stolen it and suggesting I was driving drunk. And I was just like, can you call my father? He has all the information about the car. I have my father's number. And the guy just kept refusing and putting the heat on me. And I was like, look, I don't know the details about the car. So when my father did finally get called and did arrive on the scene, he basically filled me in like that's one of those cops whose joy is derived from making people sweat and manipulating people and causing fear in them. And that's when he kind of confided in me. He's like, that's what I hate about the force sometimes, is that it's like 2/3 to 3/4 those people. And it's not doing any good for the impression of police officers, which my father was concerned about because he had spent a decade or more working for the police union in a leadership role, vice president of the Milwaukee Police Union, which is also an interesting little history because I remember the police going on strike at one point, and when I was about 9, having the sheriffs stop into our new home and say, we have to arrest you because you've walked away from the table. The city's holding the union in contempt. So my dad spent a night in jail fighting for labor rights for cops. I guess one of the standouts for me that's kind of coming into my head is the time I went camping with my cousins and my aunt and uncle. And they were my Italian cousins, meaning that my father's sister married an Italian man. And so She had 3 boys, so these were 3 male cousins, all within all within 3 to 4 years of my age, 1 younger and 2 older, and they were my hunting cousins. I didn't really hunt. My dad didn't really hunt. So it was my first time kind of going out to their land. They had land, and they just had a pop-up trailer that they would take there. But it was my first time engaging with, like, hey, let's go play with guns, guns, shotguns and pistols and rifles and things like that. And it was kind of weird because it was a little bit unsupervised, and I wasn't expecting that. I think we were all about 13 or 14, and my uncle gave us kind of a brief of the rules. Always keep the muzzle down. When you have a loaded weapon, never walk in front of each other if your weapons are loaded. Walk side by side. Check your field before you shoot. Make sure that there's a backstop of some sort, a forest or whatnot, and just be safe. Never stand in front of each other with loaded weapons. And then he just let us off. It's like, oh, have fun. So we then just walked off into the woods. And the woods of northern Wisconsin are really they're shaped by glacial activity. So there's like lots of like hills and dips and little kettles and things like that. So we were climbing through all this brush, and we'd run across like a few beer cans from like the 1950s. So we'd set them up and shoot them. We'd find something else, and like some sort of old plastic case, and we'd go set it up and blow it apart with shotguns. But in reflection, like one of the things that really makes me think about that experience in a different light is just how different the world is now, in terms of I don't necessarily know anyone in my circle who would ever even think to give teenagers guns. That doesn't mean somewhere in America people aren't, because people are, but then just let them loose unsupervised, which I think also might speak to how sheltered I am at this part of my life. But I kind of liked that freedom. I kind of liked that trust. And the fact that my aunt and uncle were kind of willing to give that to myself, along with my cousins, was pretty cool. Not that my parents were really strict, but I think my mother would freak out about that kind of thing. So yeah, I think by the end of the day, it was just really cool. We came back, and my uncle was like, "So now you got some practice shooting. Let's shoot at some targets." And even I think I've only been at that point. I had only been shooting with my father once, and he was really kind of not interested in us getting as involved with guns. I think some of it was because of his profession, and that he knew ultimately that, there's a lot of people who misuse guns as part of his job. So he had a completely different take on them.
Real quickly, I'd like to take a brief moment to let you, the listener, know how you can help support the podcast. The number one thing you can do to help this podcast grow and thrive is to share it with your friends. Invite people to like the Facebook page. Share the YouTube videos. Follow the podcast on Twitter, and most importantly, subscribe to the podcast through iTunes or Stitcher, and leave a review. Now, back to our interview with Brad Fortier. Okay, Brad, let's move on to your education.
So I started out in primary school. I mean, should we take it from the beginning? Just kind of follow the trail?
Follow the trail, yep.
So started out getting Catholic education in private schools for the first 12 years of my education, grade school, middle school, high school. And it was interesting, growing up in a faith community is always interesting for a lot of reasons. And, some good, some not so good. I mean, that's just kind of part of the game when you're growing up around people. There's all kinds of people, no matter what community you're in. It was great. I was taught by the School Sisters of Notre Dame. Very well. Some of the nuns, not so nice. It's funny because, we always joke about the stereotype about Catholic nuns, and I ran into some of that. Nothing, no physical abuse, but a lot of mental abuse. In terms of, I'm 8. I need to go to the bathroom, and I'm harangued and insulted for wanting to go to the bathroom. I'm like, really? Anyway. The good things about it were the discipline, were the consideration of others, and just, in general, it's always nice to give kids a good background in morality and our responsibility to each other as a community. But in the midst of that, Dungeons and Dragons emerged as a popular entertainment. So in I think it was 1981, my good friend Brian had gotten the basic set for Dungeons and Dragons. And Brian was the son of one of my father's high school, I don't want to say buddies, they went to the same high school, but we ended up going to the same grade school in middle school. So Brian invites me over to play Dungeons and Dragons, and it's this new game, and it's weird because the rules are totally different. The rules are about telling a story. It's not about winning. It's not about competing. It's about imagining. And of course, parents have no idea, no concept of that. So thankfully, we had parents who allowed it and said it doesn't seem to be too harmful. But I remember we went through this phase in Dungeons and Dragons, and I lump this into my education because what I'm talking about right now has so much to do with what I'm doing in my life now. So we basically use the rules to create these amazing fantasy realities, and my other Dungeons and Dragons playing friends from the time, we always refer to these first explorations of Dungeons and Dragons as the impossible days, because we would create these extremely powerful characters that could run off and basically defeat or charm gods from the Norse gods to the Egyptian gods, and it was all kind of ridiculous. It's what a teen boy would want, I control everything. I am the master. No one can tell me to do anything. I have powers unimaginable. But then it got boring, because I've charmed 8 gods. I have everything I could ever want. What more is there to do? So we kind of rebooted that somewhere in early high school. And high school was interesting because the core of us who met in middle school at the grade school I was in, the Catholic grade school I was in, we all kind of splintered to different high schools. Some went to public high school, some went to private high school, but still we would get together for playing Dungeons and Dragons. So we kind of doubled down on the rules after that and said, you know what, this is kind of getting boring. Let's see what happens if we actually kind of follow the rules and try and figure this out. And things got better. They were still kind of imaginative, and we would be things that weren't necessarily like a human or a dwarf or an elf. We had the option of I wanted to be, a brownie, some little magical creature from the forest, and I could play that character. But there were penalties. We used a little bit more of the reality. But all this while, we would also kind of escape and use this notion of going off on an adventure and dungeoneering in our real lives. So we started to get together on some weekends and not play Dungeons and Dragons, but stay up after dark, paint ourselves with black makeup and wear dark clothing. And since we were on the fringes of Milwaukee, we were in the suburbs, there were lots of rain drainage tunnels and sewers that we could go into. So that's what we started doing. We would make these ad hoc weapons out of like old broomsticks and nails and things like that. We would take shoe polish and like wipe it on our faces, and we would take black t-shirts and tie them off so we had like ad hoc ninja masks, and we would run through backyards being like, ninjas. And then go into this huge system underneath the suburbs of rain drainage tunnels, and just see what was down there. And it was incredibly thrilling because sometimes we would pop up, move like a little, I don't know, what do you call those, sewer caps over, and stick our heads out, and occasionally we almost got decapitated by a car coming by. But just the thrill of breaking the rules and also like walking through a dark tunnel like our characters did to get a feel for it, an actual physical feel, was really engaging. And also it gave us like perspective and a better tools for creating narratives in that milieu. So yeah, from there, out of high school, I kind of graduated with I think a good general background. I went to college, not right away. I waited kind of half a year. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was 18 in college. I kind of liked languages, so I went part-time and paid for college for myself for a while I was working at UPS. And I studied French. I think I studied French for 4 years, and I studied French in high school for 4 years, so I was actually pretty fluent for a while. But then that got boring, so I started studying communications, and then that got boring, so I started studying creative writing. And then I just kind of quit college because I was spending all this money and I didn't know why. But I was earning a lot of money working for UPS, and I had also recently discovered drugs and alcohol. It was one of those, you pass out of high school and into college. And it was really strange because I was straight edge, like up until graduating high school. And it's actually, I was like, ugh, drugs, alcohol, until I found myself that summer after graduating high school watching golf with my father while all my friends were at a party. And I was like, why am I here? Why am I watching golf with my father? This is extremely boring and not what I want to be doing. So I was just like, all right, screw this. I'm going to that party and I'm going to see what this is all about. And that party was where I first got tipsy and drunk. And then I was like, okay, I survived that. I stayed the night. I didn't have to drive. There's a safe way to approach this. And then the floodgates were off. Like that's my problem, is like I'm insatiably curious. And so once I discovered that drinking wasn't lethal, I also, one of the things that I do is before I'm going to try something, I do a lot of research on a thing. So I was like, okay, what's the amount of drinks I can have without serious physical harm?
This is the point in the podcast where I would normally recommend a book to you from audible.com. They have over 150,000 books to choose from. Visit audibletrial.com/curmudgeon to sign up for your free trial and receive one free audiobook. This week I asked my guest, Brad Fortier, to recommend an audiobook that he's enjoyed, and here's his response.
Oh, I do have one audiobook recommendation, and it has very little to do with anything I was saying, but it's one of my favorite books. World War Z by Max Brooks is an incredible audiobook. He got such amazing voice talent. And if you're a fan of the zombie genre and you haven't read World War Z, you're out of the loop. Catch up. It's incredible. Don't trust the Brad Pitt movie to have given you the real story. That was such a departure from the text, you have no idea. Read the book, listen to the audiobook. You will thank me.
So visit audibletrial.com/curmudgeon for your free trial and pick up World War Z by Max Brooks. Thank you. Now let's get back to our interview.
So Chapter 8, wherein our hero experiences drugs. So once I kind of broke through that barrier of I guess ignorance in terms of what this all means and like how to safely explore these things, people started feeding me literature because I had friends who were going to UW-Madison in Wisconsin, and UW-Madison is kind of like one of it's a large university and also a big party school. And one of my D&D friends had gone ahead of us. He was a year older than us. So he was feeding me all this kind of philosophical and New Age literature, specifically books written by Carlos Castaneda, who wrote about this Don Juan character who is an Indian shaman who specialized in using power plants, which is like peyote and other hallucinogenic plants that are used ethnobotanically by different cultures. So reading that literature, it was all based on never do this flippantly. If you're going to start exploring these plants and these experiences, you have to understand that you're opening this huge gate of power in yourself, and that if you go in flippantly, it's going to teach you something that you might not want to learn, and that is respect for it by having a bad trip. And that's kind of why you get bad trips, is you're coming in with the wrong attitude. So reading this literature really helped me mentally frame healthy, productive ways of actually using the experience for learning, as opposed to what lots of people were doing, which was using it for recreation. So I went off on this huge tangent of like, I'm going to go do what the shamans do. I'm going to go march off into the woods and camp for days alone and take these substances. And I'm lumping this into like the broad category of education. We'll get to collegiate education soon enough. The most striking experience I ever had was going up to this state park in Wisconsin called Rock Island State Park. And if you see Wisconsin on a map, I'm trying to think from your perspective, it's like this. There's this little peninsula that comes off of Wisconsin into Lake Michigan. Well, you drive all the way up on that. You take a boat with your car to a little island called Washington Island. You drive across that. You leave your car there. You take a boat across to Rock Island, and there's no motorized vehicles allowed on the island. Only foot traffic and bikes. It was middle of June, and I stayed there 6 days, and I think I took about 8 hits of acid through the whole thing. It was insane. It was an insane experiment. But during the experience, I had these incredible insights about nature and about the kind of seasonal round, and like also just connecting with the living world. And it's hard to describe the experience to people who've never been into it, because it's like walking into the fifth dimension. There's no basis for comparison in the real world. I can tell you this much, that the way those compounds work on the brain is actually, it kind of mimics what serotonin does in your brain. But serotonin is very regulated in your brain. So it's doled out in very small bits, and it sinks into these little receptors in your brain, and it's kind of controls pleasure and perception. Well, imagine if you flooded your brain with that, and all of your receptors for serotonin were getting filled with it. It's like your brain's on fire. And when your brain's on fire, your perceptions are all ignited at once, and it's an experience beyond words, oftentimes. So, coming out of that, after 5 days of privation and this kind of thing, I remember distinctly the first time I spoke again. I was at an international house of pancakes, and I was going to be meeting my friend Scott in his parents' home in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And I dialed the number, and then when I said, hey Scott, it was like hesitant because I hadn't used my voice in days. And it was like that above all was like, I realized like at some point in there I had like disengaged from my ego and my identity, and like that utterance was the thing that snapped me back into it. So I guess where does that spin us? That spins us to, let's jump ahead to 31 when I go back to school. So 2001, I go back to school to study anthropology, specifically archaeology. And for those at home who are wondering what that is, anthropology is basically the study of human beings from their origins till now. And not just like the development of their bodies, the development of their material culture, basically the garbage and the ruins they've left behind, as well as how, their physical makeup and what they do culturally and socially. So I got 4 years of that education. That led me, this was all happening simultaneously as I was engaging in the world of improvised theater, improv for short. And through that education, I started to make links of, hey, I want to find a way where I can study improvisation using anthropology as a tool. And so I pursued making my own master's degree, which Portland State University thankfully had this interdisciplinary master's program where you could actually, if you could design and develop a program that incorporated classes that they currently offered, and that you could get advisors in each of the departments you wanted to combine, you could do it. And that's what I did. I combined anthropology and theater arts and created a unique degree that allowed me to study improv as an anthropologist. And what does that mean ultimately? I didn't go into the jungles and studied how people made theater. I actually moved to Rochester, New York for 3 months and did what's called an ethnography on the improv scene there, which means interviewing, filming, surveying both performers and audience members, all in pursuit of understanding this phenomenon in improvisation called group mind, which is this near spiritual experience that comes out of doing the work together, which is a very intense kind of trusting and building upon each other's ideas. And what improvisers call group mind is where we just reach this level of participation where your ego kind of dissipates and you're actually kind of compelled by the work, by what you're doing, into action rather than by your own thoughts. It's as if the product pulls you and you are not pushing for things to happen. You're being pulled to make things happen by what's happening. So I wrote 2 books on that, and that's kind of where I'm at now with my education.
Thank you, Brad. Now let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
So what I do now, first things first, just to kind of give a little context, I graduated in 2008 with a master's degree that no one has any idea what it means. Not a good time to come into the worst economy we've had in 100 years. So I spent about 8 years floundering in poverty, kind of putting together a mosaic of employment, doing this, that, and the other thing. But as Providence would have it, and I did a lot of teaching of improv and some training gigs where I apply improv tools to create professional trainings around leadership, communications, collaboration, things of that nature. So we'll click into now with a project that I did this past August, in August of 2014. I have a colleague that I've met over the last several years, Dr. Mary Tiskevich, who runs a program called Heroic Improvisation. And what she does with her project is she uses the principles of improvisation to teach disaster preparedness for communities and disaster response using improv tools. Well, she was invited to become a part of this international aid organization called the Field Innovation Team, FIT. Well, in response to all of the Central American immigrant children that were flooding into the United States. They felt like we need to do something with them because these people are getting housed before they're getting deported. We can at least, make sure that they're mentally healthy. So they were developing some sort of education program around that. And they wondered how improv could intersect with that. And Mary is new to improv. She's just taken a couple classes, and I've been engaged in doing improv and teaching improv since 1996. So I guess that makes me an expert, along with having my master's and writing a couple books. So I said, hey, if you don't have some ideas, I think I've got an idea of how this would work. And she was like, great. I said, give me 48 hours. I'll write up a proposal. So that's exactly what I did. I read up on the anthropological literature of refugees, and I developed an improv-based program for community building in refugee communities, or refugee situations. And I sent the proposal, and 48 hours later, the executive director of the field innovation team said, this is amazing. We want you to come do this. And we're the only organization that's actually, the only non-government organization who's been invited to do these things. So come do it. So I spent 2 weeks in San Antonio piloting this program, and it was a grand success. So fast forward from there, and by the way, it was volunteer largely. They paid for my airfare and the hotel, but I had to pay for my food, and kind of my time was given for free. Fast forward after that event to October, where I applied for a job coordinating something called the Illumination Project, which is a student leadership program at Portland Community College that uses interactive theater to teach about issues of social justice, racism, sexism, classism, religious plurality, things of that nature, which is what I'm now currently doing. I've been doing that for 4 months, and we're almost finished with this term's performances, and we've specifically been focusing on racism. And I've kind of tripped into a dream job because I have never been in a job where I facilitated an event that transforms the crowd so visibly and so audibly and so clearly to this new tier of understanding an issue, kind of at a visceral level. I mean, I've written about how interactive theater and improvisation is truly a rehearsing for life events, and this is a specific and direct realization of what I had only imagined before. So I've tripped into one of the most incredible professional experiences of my life, and it's exploding my brain, and it's exploding my heart in all of the best ways. And it's confirmed a lot of things that I had believed and written about before, so I feel validated by it as well. And only recently, like as in next week, well, just a week ago, Dr. Mary Tuskevich was talking to someone from the United Nations High Council of Refugees. And she told them about Spontaneous Village, the program I had developed. And this individual said, that sounds amazing. I want you to submit a proposal to the UN High Council of Refugees for our innovation initiative, to see if we can get you grant funding to actually grow Spontaneous Village into a large, like a large scale application use to be used in the shelters where these people are going, as well as to be developed as a tool for refugee situations globally. And we're putting that proposal in next week. So you'll have to wait and see, just like me. But professionally, that's where I'm at.
We've touched on your education, your current career, your career leading up to now. but you haven't touched on your performance career in improvisational theater.
I've been a performer since 1996, a performer in improvised theater. And for those at home who are not quite sure what that is, I always start with the frame of, do you know whose line is it anyway? Because that's where a lot of people engage in improvisation. I've done improv in a whole lot of different forms. That whose line is it anyway is considered short form, games improv. But there's also a facet of improvisation where people actually make up short plays. Half-hour, 45-minute plays just based off of a few suggestions, and that's called long form. And I've done, I think about 60% of my career at this point has been long form and 40% short form. So improv, boy, it can be a lot of things. It's a super fun exercise. It's an incredible toolbox to approach life. But I've had a really blessed experience and a blessed career in terms of I haven't just performed in Portland. I've performed in Canada. I've performed across the United States. I have performed and taught in Europe. And people fly me places to do this. So it's really been, I've realized a lot of professional goals through it. Some of the most, one of the most amazing stories I have, and this is actually the story that led me to pursue the master's degree that I did. I was in Ljubljana, Slovenia in 2004 for their International Improv Festival. And I was there with the Brody Theater, which, much of my career in improv was done with the Brody Theater. And it was the final night of the festival, and people were doing these long forms, a form called the Herald, which is kind of the template for all long forms. Everything's derived from that. Well, with the Herald, you start by getting a single word suggestion. And the audience suggested patriotism. And I want to kind of paint the context, because in 2004, when we were in Slovenia, it was maybe 2 weeks before the Kerry George W. Bush elections were going to happen. And all the Europeans could talk about was the American election. So patriotism, the fact that the crowd brought that up with the final show, which I was not in, I was actually watching, suddenly created the grounds for all of this stuff to kind of come to the front. So first, all the players interpreted that patriotism suggestion. They were inspired to do what's known as an opening exercise, where we kind of blow up the ideas of what patriotism mean. And here's how they did it. It's a mixed cast of about people from 8 different countries. Well, all of these people started to, one at a time, start singing their national anthems. At first it was one at a time and you could hear them individually, but they just started to sing them into cacophony. And that set the stage for all of this intense discussion about how different countries view war and, faith to your country and things like that. And one particular moment, an Austrian woman, Trixie, stepped forward and started talking about how her grandfather was in the Blitzkrieg in Berlin on the Nazi side, because, Austrians were just kind of adopted into, the Nazi program. He didn't necessarily like the Nazis, but he was still fighting for them. At the same time, one of the Slovenians, Dražen, was talking about how his grandfather was also involved in the war on a different side. Well, as they're telling these stories, the lighting improviser creates this blue pool of light behind them. And one at a time, the other actors on the team would walk out and have these still faces, and they basically looked like dead people standing in this blue pool of light. Until there's about 6, haunting dead people in the pool of light. And Dražen and Trixie are getting to the crescendos of their monologues, talking about how the Day of the Dead in Europe was also right around the corner. And it's all about honoring the war dead. And the very last person to come onto stage and interrupt the monologues was an American who ran out on stage and said, you know, he started to wave his hands in front of the dead people, and they would drop to the floor, so that the whole stage was littered with bodies, and it looked desperate, and it was actually very affecting. Like, people were starting to cry in the audience. And then he turns around in the pool of light and interrupts the monologues and says, "In America, for Memorial Day, we go to the beach." And the lighting improviser like turned the blue to white lights, and all the bodies sat up and started putting on suntan lotion. And it turned this like tragic moment into this comedy moment on a dime. And I was just like, I learned so much about so many different cultures in that moment. I was blown away, and that's what made me think I got to study this with anthropology. There's so much going on here. A lot of my early days in the Brody, riddled with fun. But I tell you, a career in performance, especially with improvisation, like I think I was doing shows for maybe 3 years before I like felt like, oh, I've got a solid command of how to do this. And about that time, I linked up with my friend Nate, who it seemed like he and I shared a twisted comedy brain, and we did a whole lot of duo work. And it's some of the most satisfying work I've done in improvisation was with Nate. And here's why: is Nate is also this incredibly talented musician and plays 6 different instruments: pianos, keyboards, banjos, 12-string guitars, all that stuff. And I think my favorite show I did with him was in Rochester, New York, because he had moved there. And what were we doing? There was a piano on stage, because there was a play that was being used for this stage, or there was a play that was inhabiting this stage, and there was a piano in it. So it turned into like Brad and Nate's kind of comedy variety hour. Well, there was this one story thread where we played these 2 kind of spinster brothers, Reginald and Baltimore, who they were ridiculously at odds. And it turned out, I remember the scene opened with, what was I doing? Nate, or should I say Reginald was cutting limes. And they got into a little squabble over what was going to go on at the party that night. And they lived in a manor house. But everything culminated in this big Broadway musical number of how we wished we could be like we once were. And it also became kind of the, I guess, the swan song for the end of the act. This is actually turning into a very boring story.
Okay.
It's hard to, I hate third-hand events, but I guess in general, some of the reasons that I love it and love it being improv, and especially work with Nate, is that it took me back to those days of Dungeons and Dragons where you could realize magic on stage, that the only rules there were just some narrative rules in terms of, what affects the hearts of these characters? What are the wants of these characters? What compels people? And like, that's the most satisfying part of this work is constantly coming back to reflect on that problem, that very human problem, which is, what are our wants and desires? How do they drive us to do things? And how do they end up satisfying us? And ultimately, after that satisfaction arrives, what's the new impulse? And what drives that new impulse? And I think at the heart of improvised work is that reflection on the human condition. And, you start at the beginning of this performance career learning all these rules and tools of like, hey, you've got to agree with things that come up. You have to appreciate the ideas of others. You have to be able to build on those ideas, and that's where your creativity comes in. So we have all these approaches and methods, but it really comes down to that connection. Like, how do you connect as players? How do these characters connect as people, or disconnect? And if they are disconnected, how can we explore that relationship and find connection despite dis-ease? So, yeah, a lot of my career was finding people of like minds getting together and doing that. I think it was 2011, and I was performing. I was actually the guest director for the Vienna International Improv Festival, and I was coupled together with two other English-speaking performers, my friend Jim, who's originally from Maine, and this woman Kate, who's from Ireland. And it was the coolest thing because the festival had wanted us to do what's called station theater. So we start the stories in a theater, and then we move onto the streets and do scenes on the streets in different places in Vienna and end up at the other theater where the festival was and finish our stories. Well, it was incredible because we ended up in the middle of it getting to the oldest cathedral in Vienna. It's like this huge historic landmark built in the 1400s, incredible stained glass. And they're like, oh, we're going to go do a scene in there. I was like, are you kidding me? And they're like, nope, this is part of the plan. So other people were taking the crowds from the show around to see these other stations. So our crowd arrives, and I'm pretending to be a tour guide at Vienna, and I don't know anything about Vienna, so I was totally exercising my BS muscles. So I'm like, all right, everybody, we're going to go into the cathedral now and learn a little bit about its history. And Jim and Kate were playing this like mother-son duo who were the only people on my tour. And throughout the arc of the story, I started to slowly fall in love with Kate, and Kate was starting to slowly fall in love with me. So in there, in the cathedral, I had taught the crowd that I will talk, but I'll make hand signals that'll make certain things. So I taught them a hand signal vocabulary and gave them this weird, like, semi-talked and semi-gestured tour of the cathedral. And all of these people who were there to visit the cathedral were just like looking at us, and I was like, this is my job. Most incredible show I think I have ever done. Once we got to the end and finished the story, you know, Jim's character is finally like, he's like, you don't know anything about Vienna, do you? And I was like, you got me. I just need some money. And Kate's like, I don't care, I love him, you know. And the whole thing culminated in Kate and I like embracing and kissing, with Jim looking on disgustedly. He's like, you're scamming my mother. Incredible, very satisfying, but also a testament to the fact that improvisation, the skills of improvisation, can kind of like help you weather any kind of diversity, especially the camaraderie of knowing that you have two other people or three other people or one other person that's there to totally commit and support you. And boom, that's exactly what happened.
I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Brad Fortier. If you're interested in finding out more information about Brad, improvisational theater, or buying one of his books, I've put the links in the show notes. You can find information about this episode and past episodes at curmudgeoncafe.com. And of course, you can always find us on Facebook. Make sure to share us with your friends. Follow us on Twitter. As always, one of the best things you can do to help out the podcast is to subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher and leave us a review. Thank you for listening to the Curmudgeon Cafe podcast, and I hope you join us next week.